Hey everybody, welcome back to the second session of the morning. So with us today we've got Scott DeWoody. Scott is going to do a presentation on substance in architecture, engineering, and construction. So take it away, Scott.
All right, thank you, Wes. Let me just get my timer started all right, good morning, everyone. My name is Scott DeWoody. I am the firm-wide creative media manager at Gensler. That essentially means I oversee all of our rendering technologies in terms of just visualization, VR, AR, motion graphics, and that nature. And even though I'm second out of the gate tonight, I thought I'd change it up a little bit in talking about how Substance is really changing our workflows for architectural visualization in design. I'm not an architect or interior designer by trade. I'm actually a CG illustrator. I was hired at Gensler about 10 years ago to just start doing illustrations in-house and just working and creating workflows around that, and now I'm overseeing that at the firm. So for those of you who don't know us, we were established about 53 years ago in San Francisco by a man named Art Gensler, and he had just had a little hole-in-the-wall shop in San Francisco, and then today we are across 9 regions in the world with 44 offices spanning about 5,500 employees. So we're got quite a few designers working for us. And for some projects that you may know that we've done is we've done the Shanghai Tower, which is a 600-meter tower in China, which is the largest tower currently there. Also a little more locally, we are responsible for LA Live, if anyone's been down there, and also now the new LAFC football club stadium that Bank of California has been sponsored by. So that's just give a little brief history about kind of the work we do, but we do just about everything except residential. So we do restaurants, hospitality, a lot of commercial office building, campuses, schools, things of that nature. And so I really wanted to talk about our design process. And there's a lot in the design process, from just sketching and storyboarding all the way through construction and coding and meeting requirements and permitting. But of course, today what we really want to focus on are the materials section of the design process. And this is a really, really important process for us because the materials, just like doing any kind of illustration or other design work, really set the mood and the feel for the space that we're trying to create and the experience we're trying to drive. And even so much that our Gensler Chicago Instagram just the other day decided to post a little behind the scenes of their design inspiration that they're currently working on. And this is pretty typical of what we see in the office all day, is that there's just material palettes laid out everywhere, and designers are checking out new things, and vendors are constantly coming in and bringing more and more materials for everyone. And so in every office, we have a massive, and I mean massive, material library that all of this stuff is kept, and designers can come in and browse and check out things and look at anything from all these little fabric samples for wall coverings and upholstery to, potentially pre-made configurations by a vendor just to get some inspiration going and seeing what works well with others. And even all the way to stones and glass and bricks. I mean, you name it, it's in this library. And I remember taking the guys from Algorithmic about 2 years ago over to our LA one, and jaws were on the floor. They could not believe how many materials we have, and we're constantly cycling through and again getting more and more materials. And the big thing to note is that we do visualize everything. We render everything from restrooms to elevator cabs to break rooms to even little print rooms sometimes. If the client wants to see what it's going to look like before we build it, we're doing a rendering of it, and renderings require materials. But let's talk about some applications in our pipeline real quick first. This is just about all the tools we end up using. There are a few others I probably left out, but our core design tools are Revit, Rhino, SketchUp, and 3ds Max. Our render engines, we primarily use V-Ray, but we use I-Ray and a few others. Clearly, our material pipeline has been replaced by Substance now completely. I have a global render farm, about 200 machines across the entire firm around the globe for rendering. And we've now adopted Avail for asset management, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. And then, of course, with the game engines, we're heavily using Unity and Unreal for a lot of our workflows. And then we've got a lot of other little interactive tools now, like Lumion, Fuser, Enscape, Iris, Clever, Twinmotion, Revisto, and it just kind of rounds out the package for us. We really try and provide the designers a plethora of tools so they can easily communicate our ideas to our clients, because that's what helps sells our projects. And so this is sort of all the overall visualization pipeline. We'll have designers usually starting in Rhino and SketchUp for a lot of early concepting and massing and even computational design. And then we'll move into Revit eventually, either bringing that geometry in, which is sometimes not the greatest idea, and that's a conversation for another time. But we'll essentially, we end up in Revit. Revit's our core platform because we can do all of our documentation sets and scheduling, and it's just a really, really nice, robust BIM platform for us. And from there, we can do extra visualization with V-Ray for Revit, or we can move into applications like Fuser and Enscape, which are some more of this quick real-time gaming, one-click solution things. And then if we want to do more advanced visualization, we pipe it over to 3ds Max, and we can start using V-Ray or iRay and Forest Pack Pro and RailClone to really like flesh out the renderings for more high-end high-end rendering. And then from there, we also can then pipe that stuff to Unity and Unreal. This is pretty atypical. And the beautiful thing is that Substance allows us to jump or bring our materials across the entire platform without much limitation. And that's usually been one of the things because most of these applications handle materials in their own way. Now, thankfully, in the latest versions of V-Ray, the VR matte file format translates across the board real easily. But even then, if I'm going to Fuser and Enscape, those are going to pull Revit materials, and Revit handles materials in a very unique way. And so essentially what we're doing is now we're using these platforms, the Substance platform, to create a material once, and then I can easily say that same material with a naming convention, and I can create a V-Ray material, I can create a Revit material, I can take the Substance file into Unity or Unreal, or I can even make an MDL and pipe that between iRay and V-Ray without much issue at all. And so this really helps streamline our process because, again, materials are really important to us, and we don't really need the designer having to recreate the material every time they jump into a different platform. And so usually what will happen is I'll get a SketchUp model that may look like this, and then I may get a Revit model that may look like this. And then I'll bring them into 3ds Max, and I'll start applying some base materials and lighting and all of that nature. And then I'll shoot back to the designer something that looks like this. We call it a white model rendering, where it's just simple one tone, maybe two tone to help a little contrast. But what I'm looking for is for them to establish the camera shot and the lighting to make sure the look and feel of this feels good before we start pushing forward. And then usually I get something back from the designer that looks like this. Now, this is a much, much more cleaner version than what I usually get. Usually there's a lot of Sharpie and illegible handwriting to go along with it, but I didn't want to show you any of that. But you can see they're pointing out where materials are going to be going and where I need to make sure I specify what shaders go where. And who thought like paint by numbers would pay off as an adult? But it works. And so then they'll start giving me samples like this that I used to have to either photograph or put on a scan bed, and then we'll take it into Photoshop, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I'll get labels like this and samples that look like this, just saying, hey, put this here, put that there, and then when I'm done, we get the pretty rendering in the end. And then this may go through a couple other iterations. They may comment that, oh, the red on that banquette, that's not the right shade of red and all of that, which is where, if you're not color calibrating your screens, that's really, really important, especially in this line of work. So I do recommend doing that. But the biggest problem is that we have with this process is the actual size of the sample. And this is where it starts to get really tricky because these samples are not big. Looking at this is kind of like my foot next to this little wooden block. Or we have these little fabrics now that are going either on a wall or a chair or something of that nature, but we don't get the full repeat in that. That's not the entire pattern. That's just a little snippet of it. So now what do we start doing? I mean, I've got to put that all over a chair or a wall? How does that work? And even here, just showing like this is a 4-inch sample. And so it gets a little tricky when you're just having to photograph this stuff. Again, just kind of showing how big these samples really are again. And so we'll go back to the white model render, and this is how we used to have to do things, which was a pain. I love materials, but I always hated doing materials in visualization because I'd have to do this, and then I'd be like, okay, you're getting this little wood sample, and this goes here, and I go where? And they go here. And I wanted to do a time-lapse video of me taking this wood sample and creating a wood tileable texture. And I started, and about a minute in, I got so frustrated I had to stop. So I'll show you the Substance graph instead. And so this is essentially a really, really quick, I don't spend too much time on them. The materials, for the most part, designers want them super clean and sleek and all that. We don't add a lot of dirt and grime or explosions or fire, sadly. You know, they want it pristine, like we just pulled the wrapper off of it, and that's fine, it's good, because that's what, you know, we want to have a really polished look for our stuff. But, you know, wood is challenging, and actually Wes has a really good YouTube video on making wood that I actually had used. This is one of the first substances I had actually made. So I do recommend checking that out if you guys are looking to know how to make some wood. And then here's the final image. So that substance is now all over where the designer wanted the wood, and it's a much easier process. I can actually get something that looks unique, that doesn't look like I had just the same piece of wood tiled over and over again and I had to really manipulate that too much. I can just create a couple nodes real quickly in about 5 or 10 minutes, and I'm getting the look and the feel that the designer wanted. And so let's take a look at some of the smaller, you know, fabric samples, for instance. So what do we do now that we have these? And thankfully, the manufacturer websites actually do end up showing the full repeat, plus all the other color options. And so what I have been doing is that really easily, it's like breaking down these into simple patterns and shapes and using Substance to then create the variations. And so you can see in this graph here, I start with the basic pattern and create that. And then I start adding some thread detail and some more smaller micro detail. I mean, this is pretty typical Substance workflows. If you've seen a lot of other people doing and creating substances, this is pretty straightforward. And then at the end, the color grading is where it gets really interesting, because that's where I start creating a multi-switch that I then create each branded color from the manufacturer, that now when I give the Substance file to someone, they can easily select whatever color they want and see those changes in real time in a game engine. Or what I'll be showing too is that I then export bitmaps out for each of these, and I create V-Ray materials, and we add them to our library, and then a designer can just go into our library and pick the material and add it into their scene. And so here are just a couple of close-ups of this fabric. And by the way, I have all of these samples on me if you guys do want to hit me up later and actually take a look at them. And just piping through some different color options. And then here I did a little animation so you can see how V-Ray is handling the output from Substance Designer. And this was a really interesting material. And so this is where it starts to get a little tricky, because a single photograph and a website isn't going to do this material justice, because all the color in this material is like a metallic fiber. So it has this very interesting sheen to it. So really, if you can have the actual sample on hand, that does really well. And again, just kind of going through this and actually having to make a metallic channel and getting that nice reflectivity to it. And we'll go into how I convert these, but there is there's a really good convert node that is in Substance Designer that will pipe this to essentially any ray trace engine. I use V-Ray mainly, but they have Corona, Redshift, and Arnold presets, and I think maybe 1 or 2 other engines. And again, just kind of doing a little animation so you can see how the reflectivity moves around. Now this guy is the really, really interesting one. I would hate to do this by hand in any other 2D application, because this guy, each one of these little diamonds has these little grooves that are angled and positioned a different way. So depending on where the light and your angle that you're looking at it is, each one of these little guys sparkle a different way or look matte. And I have this too, so you guys can see this. And this was a really nice challenge. And so I started with the diamond pattern, ended up making I'll call it grout, but it's not grout, but the border of the pattern using the edge detect as normal. And then down here where it says pattern lines, I took a gradient node, I tiled it on itself quite a bit to kind of start to get that chiseled pattern look. Made a couple random masks based off of the luminance variation on this tile sampler node, and then piped each one of those in and blended them together. So now I've got randomization of different angles and whatnot going on with each diamond. And then pretty much the shader handles the rest of it, because it's now reflecting with the normal map differently. And we'll try and dive into these in a little more in depth. I do have them on me. So we can just see some different color options again, and then you can see how the light really plays with that one. That was a fun challenge. And then here is just sort of more of a in practical use application of that same material. And so here is a video I recorded of myself doing the conversion to V-Ray. And so I'm essentially creating a new blank graph. I'm just going to call it V-Ray. And then I created a special node around the convert node that's already in Substance Designer for this. And so let me just see if I can, nope, spoilers. See if I can pause this. So usually you'll have the, let's see if I can get this paused right. There we go. You'll have the base color, the normal, the roughness, height, and the bump. And when you're going to a ray trace engine, most of them, but some of them do now actually support that. So if you're going to the Autodesk ray trace engine, if you're going to, I believe, Redshift and Corona both support metal roughness now. You don't really need to go through this, but for V-Ray, what ends up happening is that it doesn't support metal roughness, and so it does something that I like to call reflection glossiness. And then, for instance, metals in the diffuse map in V-Ray actually need to be black, whereas in the base color, that's where the actual metal color goes. And so now you've got, what the convert node will do is actually will flip-flop that stuff for you. So it's really important to run this. But it was, in Substance 6, it was missing a few, and now I know in 2017 they actually upgraded the node a little bit. So ideally what I ended up doing is I just created a few extra input nodes to handle few extra channels that I may have. That way, essentially, I can just connect these two instantly like that, right-click, say, generate my outputs like that, and now I've converted to V-Ray, and now I just need to export these bitmaps to V-Ray itself. I'll just pick its resolution. I'll do that at this one at 2K. I'll just forward this along a little bit. You don't need to see me name all of this. But here then, I'm going to open up the new standalone V-Ray material editor that comes with V-Ray for Revit. But you'll find this in Revit, Rhino, SketchUp, and it's the same for 3ds Max. That's not playing. There we go. So I'll do a new material, and essentially we're going to load the diffuse into the diffuse map, like so. For fabrics and really matte-looking materials, it's not. I found it not great to crank up the reflectivity color to pure white. They become still too shiny, so really lowering that down to more of a 20% gray usually works. The biggest thing to note is now when you start loading in other bitmaps like the glossiness channel or even what I'm about to do is the normal map, is that when you bring these into a ray trace engine like this, you need to make sure that the ray trace engine understands that these maps are linear and not sRGB. And so you'll see that here in a second when I load this normal map in, that I'm switching this from screen space sRGB to render space linear. And that's because these bitmaps are controlling data inside of the V-Ray shader. And with the sRGB, the gamma is going to throw that off, and the material is not going to render properly. You'll do that essentially, and I've got a list, but you'll do that with the glossiness, the height map, and the normal, and essentially anything else that's controlling data. The diffuse map, reflection map, and any specular maps, those are to be sRGB only. And that's the material. And so here, now, once I've created all these presets and these V-Ray materials, a designer that's rendering in V-Ray for Revit, for instance, can easily start swapping out these materials on the fly. They don't even need to start worrying about the substance at this point. And we're starting to create a very comprehensive library. And so in V-Ray for Revit, how it works, it's actually going to look at all the materials that are inside the Revit model, and V-Ray allows you to override those specific materials with a V-Ray material. And so now I'm going to open up a veil to look at our material library that's on the network. Now, some of these materials are pre-made by Chaos Group, but the ones we're going to look at here in a second are the exact same substances I've been showing you today. So I'm just going to filter down to the upholstery, and I'm just going to click and drag essentially from a veil into V-Ray for Revit. And a user can just quickly replace a material like that, and then we'll fire off a rendering. We'll re-render this scene. And if I were to render this with V-Ray RT inside of Revit, I can actually change the materials on the fly while it's rendering, and I can see those updates happen in pretty much real time. Especially if I got a couple of GPUs cranking on this thing, it's super fast. Here I'm just showing that you can change the scale. It is in millimeters, but it defaults to essentially 1 foot by 1 foot in V-Ray for Revit. And there it goes. And so now you can already see the light cache is calculated and that the material on those sofas looks a little different. And I'm just going to turn up V-Ray Swarm to kick in the network rendering. And so now if a designer decided that this is the finishes they wanted on this model, and now they want to take this into Unity, for instance, they could grab the substance file I generated to create these V-Ray materials and have the exact same material and the same look. Just click and drag that into Unity and reapply. And we're looking to actually automate some of that stuff internally by creating some scripts But that's pretty much it. There it goes. Here is just a really quick video of showing how to do it in 3D Studio Max. I'm going to skim through this a little bit because it's essentially the same process. You drag out a V-Ray node, and we're going to hook up each of the maps. Again, switching, making sure they're set to linear or sRGB, and then we fire off the render. We can just see how that comes out through in V-Ray. So pretty straightforward stuff there in Max. And then again, this is the list I was talking about, and that's the little checkbox in 3D Studio Max if you're using that platform, that you just need to make sure that those materials get override to 1.0 and not 2.2. And you're good to go with moving from Substance to a ray trace engine. I know I specified this with V-Ray, but really it does work with pretty much every single other Maxwell, Corona, Redshift, you name it. This is pretty straightforward for them. And so let's talk about some material scanning. This is probably going to be the next biggest thing, and we've already heard, especially in the keynote, that this is definitely a focus for algorithmic, and I'm really excited about that because I know in Substance 6 they started with some of their tools, and then they posted this a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago now, and that got me really excited. And so I ended up kind of creating my own rig at the office, not necessarily with a cell phone because I do a lot of photography on the side, so I was like, well, I've got a camera and a tripod. Let's see what we can do with this. And so I've got my D600 mounted on my tripod. I've got a flash off to the side. I did end up printing the target sheet that Algorithmic created, and that helped out tremendously in the scanning process. And I've got a really cheap Cowboy Studio remote trigger on my flash. I think they're like $15 on Amazon, so you don't need to get anything too crazy if you want to do this. And I do have my camera tethered to my MacBook, so I can actually fire the camera remotely from my computer instead of having to fiddle with the camera, because you don't want to introduce any motion or skew the image too much. And so real quick, if anyone wants to know the gear I'm using, that is what I set up. Some of it's super expensive because, again, I do photography on the side, but some of it I like to not spend too much money on. I'm also from Texas, so my weight bag doesn't use sand or water. I actually have shotgun pellets weighing that down. They're super cheap, easy to clean up. You just put them in a Ziploc bag and you forget about it. They're really nice. Yeah, and I did have a webinar with NVIDIA earlier this year on some of this stuff, a little more in depth, and I know Wes did a fantastic job on the workflow through setting up this on YouTube as well. And so here's a leather sample I ended up scanning. This is essentially the node, and it's not really too complex. I only did 4 shots instead of 8 on this one. You can see it rendering with iRay here, and then this is essentially the 4 photographs, and then a close-up of that leather in a scene. And then I did another fabric just to see what else I could do with it and to see if fabrics would go well, and this actually went pretty straightforward. Same process, nothing too crazy, nothing too different, and there are the 4 shots, and then a nice rendered sample of that material as well. All right, so let's actually get into an actual case study, an actual project. Usually I don't get to talk about these too much because of all the confidentiality we have with our clients. But thankfully, NVIDIA was kind enough to let us talk about their campus today. And this is one project that I worked on for about 2 years in and out of San Francisco. And so we'll talk about how Substance was used on this, also using MDLs, which was an interesting workflow for us because no one had really done what we had done on this project yet. And I do want to make a quick shout out to some of the team on the NVIDIA side, because the next few renderings I'm going to show, the materials are actually generated by them. So Ashley Martin-Tarr and Daniela Jackson under Andrew Page at NVIDIA generates all of the materials you're going to see here. So how I got involved with the NVIDIA campus, and just a brief history. It's 500,000 square feet on 2 floors. It's a really low profile, large triangle. We kept the triangle, again, for like polygons and all of that design stuff. But more importantly, the CEO of NVIDIA asked us, what does 100 lux feel like? And that was an interesting question because usually when we do renderings and illustrations, they're always artistic representations. They're not really exactly what it's going to be. We can say it's going to look and feel like this, but in a court of law, it probably wouldn't pass for anything. So NVIDIA had a technology called iRay, which is a really advanced GPU renderer that is extremely accurate in calculating lights and materials. And so Jensen was like, we're going to simulate this building like I simulate my chips before we ever build it. He's like, I want to know exactly what I'm getting, and I want to know exactly what it looks like before we ever break ground. And so we were tasked in creating a new pipeline, which was an augment of my current pipeline. Looks like this. And what we essentially were doing is we were using Iray to really see how light was bouncing around and how materials were interacting with that. And the CEO wasn't going to sign off on anything until he saw it rendered this way. And so, again, we started with Rhino and SketchUp, and we piped everything to Revit. Now, with our 2 lighting consultants, we took their lighting data and we pumped that into Revit through IES files. On the side, the designers were picking materials constantly, and we were photographing them and taking them into Photoshop and Lightroom at the time. And then what we also did is we sent and this is where it gets interesting, we actually sent the actual physical material sample to NVIDIA in Berlin, where they had, I'm going to call it black magic, but a special machine that actually scanned the BRDF of every material that we sent. That then got wrapped into an MDL along with the diffuse map, essentially the photoshopping I was doing, and that got packaged up. And then we plugged everything through Max into Iray, a standalone version of Iray, and every material we were rendering was essentially physically accurate to a very precise degree, along with the exact lighting information from the lighting consultants, produce very, very believable, realistic-looking renderings. And then along comes Substance, and they start adopting Iray and MDLs into their package, and we adopted that into our workflow, which is where Ashley and Daniela came into play. And so what this allowed us to do, and on the GPU, is that we could start doing crazy fast iterations, because also NVIDIA decided to create their VCA technology, which is their GPU cluster. So if you've ever seen those boxes that have like 8 GPUs stacked in them, I had access to about 20 of those at one time. Yeah, so if you ever want to know what rendering with like 260 GPUs is like, it's almost near real-time ray tracing, and it was crazy. And so we would just do an unbelievable amount of iterations on things. We would just change the color to change the color and see what it looked like, because we could. And we could actually see how the light and the interaction was bouncing. I mean, take a look at this green thing on the bottom, and you can see how the green is reflecting onto the ceiling and all of that. And that was really, really powerful information for us. And so now that we have all these big physical MDLs, this is pretty much near what the final result is going to look like. And I showed these off at GTC back in April, May. And this is it. I mean, these renderings are fairly close. Some materials are missing because, again, the final finishes on some of this stuff still wasn't selected at the time that we did the renderings. But this terrazzo is beautiful. This MDL is unbelievable. And some of this wood, one of my other favorite renderings is coming up. But you can just really see how clean the paint and everything is looking. I can't explain it. This is a really, really powerful tool for us. And then just integrating that scan data in, which I believe Sebastian's talking tomorrow at SIGGRAPH about that with a new AXF from X-Rite. So really excited to see that presentation and where that's going to be going. I did ask for one of those X-Rite scanners for work. They're really expensive, and I got laughed out of the room, but that's okay. That's why I have my camera set up as a rig now. But even this one too, like the wood, the terrazzo, there's you can't really see it, but the copper back there is these little penny tile MDLs that they look fantastic. Ashley and Daniela did a fantastic job on this. And they were thankful enough to give me a couple screenshots of their graphs, and so this is one of their graphs for this crazy metal mesh material that we've got hanging around the campus. Here's another cloth, another fabric, probably a wall fabric in one of the conference rooms. And then here's a carpet tile that's in some of the break room areas that has a really interesting pattern. And that's pretty much my presentation. Before I get to questions, I guess we'll go ahead and just jump into Substance Designer real quick and just show off some of those materials I was talking about. And so let's take a look at this one real quick, because what I want to point out is that since this guy had this really metallic look to it, in the V-Ray Convert, usually what I end up doing for most dielectrics, I end up not exporting all of the channels. Usually the reflection channel is just white. But again, because earlier I stated that in ray trace engines that they're using more of like a diffuse reflection glossiness workflow, The diffuse color is still there, but if we look at the reflection, notice that the orange is there because we needed to add that orange specular color on top of it to get that more metallic. The other channel to pay attention to, if you're using a dielectric and it's just a dielectric, this index of refraction channel usually is just a gray tone, which makes the index of refraction about 1.4, which is about right for a metal roughness workflow. But since I added a metallic channel, it's not completely solid, so I needed to export this channel as well and plug that into the index of refraction slot inside of V-Ray. Other than that, it's like I said, this is pretty straightforward. We can take a look at do open reference. We can take a look at what I essentially added to this. I took the convert node and I set it to V-Ray GGX, which then in turn gives me a base color input, a normal color input now. This is new. This is new in 2017. I just learned that today. Roughness and metallic. And so then I created just two color input nodes that accept base color and normal color inputs, roughness, metallic, and I hooked all that up. And then I added a height and bump just in case. The reason why I have a bump map there is that Revit does natively not take normal maps. So if I'm making a shader inside of Revit, I can't use the normal map. So I have the option to have a bump map just in case. And then I just go ahead and automatically created the output nodes and packaged it in its own graph. And so when you bring that in, you just use the material connections and it just connects up really quickly like this. I have these two nodes, I'll just connect, right click, create, output, and now I've got everything made the way I need it to. And you set the resolution and you're on your way. Let's take a look at, let's see, I've got a few more minutes. Here's the graph for that crazy one with the diamond pattern. Let's see if we can get this. There we go. Yep, stop. So I just started with a simple polygon. I squished it a little bit. I filtered it into a tile sampler and then played with the luminance range to get a variation on it. Again, edited up the edge detect so I could get, I'll call it grout, but it's not grout. If you do a lot of bricks, essentially it's the same workflow. I blurred it a little bit, crushed it with the levels, inverted it to help make a mask. And then here are all the other I used a gradient map essentially to start picking out specific ranges for the randomization of where those hatches were going to go, and then crushed it with the levels to help make the mask. And then, let's go back. If we come down here, here's that gradient ramp I was talking about. Crushed it a little bit, tiled it profusely, probably more than I should have. Blurred it just a little bit, and then piped that into multiple transform 2D nodes and rotated them randomly and then reblended them in per each mask. And then filtered all that back up. And then what I've got going on up here is that switch node, which essentially is picking each branding color that if I click out into the graph and I hit the preview, this is where essentially the user can come in and say, I want to go sunrise, and we can see these just start flipping between each of the different colors that this material is made with. And then I just pumped that through some different color variations just to add some variation to each one of these little diamonds as well, just to add a little more depth and complexity to it. And and there comes the base color. The roughness map is pretty much a combination and just some level crushing and playing around with that there. Combined the normal map for the grout and the hatches together, so this is what that looks like. And then all together, you can see I added some other little subsurface detail on the grout edges too, just to give it a little more warning. Because if you really look at the material, it's not completely perfect there. And then the metallic, and then there's a height map, but I'm not really using the height map all that much on this material. Let's see. I didn't really have this one in my presentation, but I did show that this is one of those little 4-inch samples I was talking about. So again, getting on the website, figuring out what the actual repeat was. This one was a little challenging because I had to essentially start with just a square. I squished it. I used a splatter circular and then was able to then just fill in the center with a circle real quick like that. And then what was really weird is that I was trying to get this to look right, and for some odd reason it wasn't aligning, and then I realized that this pattern is actually squished a little bit, so I had to offset that a little bit, and everything blended together, and then from there you just kind of, again, you're taking it and I'm inverting it for mask purposes, filtering that up to different colors, all back down to a node that I can then just start swapping the different options for the designers. So one thing I'm focusing on heavily right now, at least at work, is creating tools and switches and custom nodes that can help streamline this for designers if they actually need to get in here and start making them. But really, we're trying to put a team together at the moment to start creating baseline materials that the designers can just quickly access, like simple woods, metals, things of that nature, and then going into more complex methods for custom materials. Because sometimes some materials aren't even available from vendors. They are purely custom for our project, and so being able to make those this way is ideal, because doing this by Photoshop or any other 2D image editor by hand is it's a nightmare. I don't miss those days. So that's pretty much it. Does anyone have any? Do we do questions or? Yes? No? Yep? Okay. I'll open it up to anyone if.
Okay, we have 5 minutes for questions. Does anyone have one in the stage? We do have one that came in online, so let me just quickly grab that. Okay, so on YouTube, one of the viewers is asking, how do you remove the exposure gradient across the material when using flashes? Or do you use the flash point pointing towards the ceiling? Does that make sense?
Oh, for the material scanning. Actually, there is a node that you end up using, and actually let's just make a new graph, new package, new graph, substance graph. So there's a preset graph in here that you can use, and essentially this multicolor equalizer, when you input each of those, and you need to go in a certain counterclockwise or clockwise order. So if you shoot 0, you need to go 90, and so forth. You need to go around. But what this node will do is actually it takes and blends all the lighting information together and then spits out a normal map and a beetle map for you. So you really don't actually have to worry about that. That's why here you shoot each of these directions, because that node will essentially equalize the light out for you.
Awesome, thank you. We have time for one question in the stage, if anyone would like to do that. Nobody? Okay. Should we have a round of applause for Scott, please?
Thank you.
So we're amazingly on schedule, so we'll meet back here in another 10 minutes for Cliff. Cliff's talk is from Santa Monica studio. So 10 minutes to go stretch your legs, grab some soda, refreshments, and then feel free to bring any food and drink back into the
Well, it all started with me watching Terminator at the age of 12, and that was the realization that I wanted to work in this industry.
Gnomon is the school for people who want to specialize in a career as an artist in computer graphics for the entertainment industry, whether it's film or video games or animation.
The first time I visited the Gnomon campus, I was blown away. First of all, they have this just tremendous art everywhere, and the instructors were all working on computers with big screens so you could see everything that you wanted.
Every single instructor that we have when they come to campus to teach is driving in from feature animation studio, video game studio, effects studio, commercial house, and they're currently working on very exciting projects, which I think for our students makes a huge impact.
There's such a huge array of classes here, variety of classes here, everything from sculpting to drawing, from modeling to texture, effects, compositing, lighting, animation, pretty much anything that you might want to learn about, there's probably a class.
Another aspect to the Gnomon experience is the variety of events that we put together. Almost every month we invite studios and artists to come on campus and share techniques and technologies, and I think that it provides a very valuable resource for the community, but it also provides an amazing opportunity for students for networking.
As creative director at Digital Domain, I always love to have Gnomon students on my team if I can. I mean, you only have to look at the end of year reel, and it would depress me as a student from another school, I think, if I saw that level of work. I mean, I think it depresses some people already in the industry that have graduated years ago.
One word I would use to sum up what a student walks away with having come to Gnomon would be empowerment.
It really enabled me to discover who I am, who I want to be, and I'm just so fortunate and happy that I made that choice.
Gnomon to me really actually is one of the most important things that's ever happened to me. I don't even say that lightly, like I've found my wife here, found my best friends here, I have my dream job, and it really all came down to me making the decision to come here. It gave me the tools that I needed to be a capable and employable 3D computer graphics artist. And here I am now, working on Star Wars, and senior texture painter and modeler.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. It'll be like. Okay, hey everybody. Welcome to our next session. So just want to let you know, after this session, we're going to have a lunch outside around noon. So yeah, be sure to come out there. And so right now, we are very happy to have with us Cliff Schonewill from Santa Monica Studios. And Cliff is going to run through some tips and tricks to speed up your Substance Painter workflow. So take it away, Cliff.
All right. Hey, what's up, everybody? Just wanted to say thanks real quick to Algorithmic for inviting me out to talk to everybody. It's pretty awesome to be among the makers of some pretty cool tools and also the people who are doing really cool things with them. So anyway, over the next 30, 40 minutes or so, the time we have, I had taken a look at some of the titles in the courses that looked like other people were presenting, and that seemed to go pretty nice specifics to help dive people who are already intermediate or doing pretty well with Substance Painter Designer into some more advanced areas. So I kind of decided to go a little bit the other direction. I figure the biggest impact I can probably have in this time is helping people who are new or getting started with Substance Painter to kind of maximize the use of its strengths and maybe avoid a few pitfalls. So I've brought a few models, a few old models from a while back. This is just a little personal project that I did, and I'm just going to use it to kind of demonstrate a few things. The first subject that I think is pretty important to cover in Substance Painter is the ways it gives us non-destructive workflow, which is very handy. It's kind of one of these things in the category of rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Definitely have it in here, and so it's good to set things up in a way that allow you to utilize it down the road if you do want to, if you are going to be in a situation where it's going to be beneficial for you to come back, change your art, because I mean often even the best art can change for unknown reasons down the road. It could be as simple as just additional artistic iteration. It could be that you have design changes in your game that necessitate changes in your art, concept changes, so on and so forth, even legal reasons. So if you're in a pinchy spot and you're busy with a bunch of other things, it's really beneficial for you to be able to jump off of work you've already done, saving you time. Painter puts you in a pretty good spot there. It provides some checkpoints for you to, you can completely do a whole new low poly model with completely new UVs and still utilize a lot of the texture work you've already done. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And so this particular model here, for people who are familiar with Substance Painter, I'm not going to go into too much detail covering, of course, the software itself, because Algorithmic has done a terrific job with their own freely available videos. So I definitely recommend to check those out if you are newer to Substance Painter. But I will just have a few little points that I point out as I go along here. So with this model, I've just got pretty basic setup with a couple groups in which I have layers, fill layers, maybe smart materials, which are of course just groups and combinations of other effects that sort of combine together to make a certain effect. And then I'm just layering those on top of each other to get the result I'm after. So, oops, let me change my, oops. I'm very used to using an inverted zoom here, so I'm just going to go ahead and switch that. So if that bugs you, you can always switch it so that kind of forward zooms you in. So just real quick, I'm just going to introduce this asset. You can see here, for example, this leather handle. I've just got a group here called leather. And within that, I have some masks, a mask that masks the whole group. And within that, I have various effects that I can kind of strip off to get to where I was at the very beginning of everything, which is sort of a straight up fine leather material, which I'm just mixing things on. All of these things are going to be able to update because they exist as masks with effects in this layer stack. You have in Painter a layer and also a mask, which can both have their own effects stacks, which are basically a non-destructive way of layering on top of layers, if that makes sense. It's sort of a meta layer, which is really cool. So let's see here. Boom, very nice. If I go into this this metal material here, well, let me rewind a second. So first of all, Substance Painter works with your material IDs. This case is a good model to start with because it's pretty straightforward. It's a simple material. It's just one texture set. I have some other ones I've brought, and you'll often be in positions where you're working with models that have multiple materials, but this one's a good one to demo. So you can see over on the right here, I just have this one material, and that's what I'll be baking things down to. This is obviously already baked and textured, but as I go through here, we have the same effect where I'm layering in various effects just to kind of build up surface details from something simple to something complicated. You get a lot of bang for your buck with smart materials. We're kind of in this age of smart materials now, and just as a quick aside, as a kind of a general note, I think it's a little bit easy to become a little bit lazy with smart materials, just kind of throw it on and be like, wow, it looks great, I'm done. But it's always great when you can come back to your stuff if you have time. Plus you always want to get things in, check it in the context of wherever it's going to be, whether it's a game engine or otherwise. Smart materials allow you a really quick way of getting a pretty good result pretty fast. But I'd say it's a good push towards the end, but it's not the finish line. So just make sure you're spending time and love to go in there and modify it, because a procedural thing is never going to get you exactly that look that you're after. You can see here I got this weapon material, and all I've done is really tinted it green. And I did that because this is sort of a fantasy asset, and I'm always a little bit bummed out when I see fantasy stuff that's always just extremely real-world materials. It's kind of, you get a layer to play around with there and make something different. So with PBR, it's built around a rule set, doing things a certain way. But there's cases where you can stretch that, and this is one of the cases where I can, because what is this material? Who knows? it's something I've invented, right? So in this case, as I actually mixed like a copper on top of it, which is just kind of giving it a different sort of surface quality that I liked, and just using, you have access, just like you do in Photoshop, to blending layers and opacity, with which you can mix your materials and create some pretty interesting and maybe happy accident type effects, where it's not necessarily just a straightforward, this is this, this is this. You can always sort of hybridize things a little bit. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to show you how just this little bit of work that I've done in here, it's nothing too much, will be able to update to a completely new set of UVs on this model. If I pop over here real quick, you'll see this is just a little UV layout for the sword. And I've exported a version of this model where, just to kind of simulate completely changing the, let's say we went in and reorganized all this detail in here, and we stripped some things out, and we ended up having to redo the low poly, kept the overall shape, but made some changes such that the UVs are completely different. Or possibly a case where we ripped out this handle and added a new object, or we want to add a new material to it and we had to squish the UV space down. There's all kinds of instances where you might want to come back and be like, whoops, I'd have to start over normally. With Painter, we don't necessarily have to do that. So I'm going to real quick go over here to under the texture settings tab, under the display settings, we have our baking options. Oops, sorry, I clicked off of it. Make sure we got the right thing here. This is going to have to be resourced. Grab these OBJs real quick. So in here I've got just the high poly models for these various objects. And you'll notice that they're all underscored with a underscore high. And that's because Painter, like a lot of modern bakers, allows us to bake, in this case, by mesh name. So we're able to avoid the pesky old workflow of exploding your bakes or doing multiple bakes and combining maps, which I, for one, will never miss. So in here, this low poly model just has parts with the exact same name. It's just an FBX, so the objects in Maya are named accordingly, the blade high or low. And you can set your own prefixes down here if you ever would like to do so. By default, it's just _high and _low for your corresponding meshes. The only caveat for this is that you have to make sure, of course, under match, you select by mesh name. If you set this to always, it'll do just a standard bake. Everything will bake onto everything, which can work fine in a lot of cases. But in this case, I have things sort of overlapping each other that I don't want to have this leather kind of going up onto the metal. I don't want to have this bone sort of area going into the middle of that cross guard. So it's pretty beneficial to be able to just bake this way. So I'm going to real quick throw off a bake. I know this will work because it's already baked. I've done it before. However, one little tip that I find useful just to save yourself some time whenever you are baking in Painter is go ahead and I just turn all off up at the top. I'll bring that menu back up and enable just the normal map. And that's going to be a much quicker bake than doing all the channels, especially like a expensive ambient occlusion, especially if you have anti-aliasing on. It's going to take you a while. So you're able to identify and correct issues earlier on. If maybe there's a typo in one of your mesh names, and so that's not going to bake correctly on itself, or an object could have been even corrupted, or maybe you're getting a projection error with an overlap with the settings you have. You don't want to go through a whole big expensive bake to find those things out. So just kind of a basic thing, but it's helpful to save you some time. Aha, I know what I did. I forgot in the mix of things to actually switch this to the new model. My apologies, real quick. I'm going to go up here to Edit and Project Configuration. This is where you're able to source your mesh. And I'm going to select this one that's just rotated, where I've just simply rotated the UVs to, again, show the existing work in here is going to break because the textures are the same. However, you can see here there's a process bar going down. Strokes that you make in Substance Painter are stored in the 3D space. And as long as the model's in the same position and not substantially different, you're able to regain those things, and I'll show that in a little bit. First thing we're going to do again real quick is just rebake this. So real quick shout out while this is happening. I just mentioned the ability for Painter to store your strokes, everything you do, in memory, and basically recreate them whenever you do something like this where you're switching a model. I had a class yesterday, and I hadn't been in a position to utilize that for a little while, and I kind of misremembered exactly how it worked, so I kind of misspoke there, so sorry to you guys. But anyway, yes, so it is true that for this to work, for strokes and paints and things you've done in layers, such as like a paint effect stack on your mask, that stuff, the object should need to be in the same position for that to work. It would be cool one day if we can get that to work where, even if the model moves or you make a substantial change, it's still able to reference that in somehow. But for now, that's a caveat. It is still super cool, however. So here we go. It's going to recalculate some things with the new bakes that I've done to the new UVs. And, it's going to have an error. Huzzah. Why would that be? Interesting. Let me go ahead and see. I had bad mesh name on. I'm not having any luck with this right now, yesterday or today. So what should have happened there is, as I regenerated my bakes, you can see that some of them worked correctly. However, what's happening is some of these layers and some of these masks did not update. So what's possible is, did I have that on? I did have that on. So right here there's an option. It's grayed out currently. You have to have a new mesh selected in order for it to happen. but it says preserve strokes position on mesh, and so that's what's going to allow you to kind of recalculate hand painting you've done to a new model. Why it didn't work, though, I'm not sure. Has anything changed with that between, I'm using 1.73 at home, and this is 27.2, or 2017.2, so there's a possible change there as I tried this just this morning. So real quick, I'm just going to reload this project. So regarding caveats of this, uncertain what happened there exactly. However, like I said, painting that is stored in 3D view should update to your mesh accordingly. One thing that will always update to your mesh accordingly is generated effects on things like, if you go in here, let's find something. If I go into one of these masks, I have a lot of paints, I use a lot of paints. Anything that's a generated effect, like a curvature that's, edgeware that's sourcing your curvature, or maybe grunge that's being thrown into your AO, like to point out a few typical examples. That's always just coming from your source images, or your bakes in this case. So you can utilize that to your advantage if you, to avoid situations where if your model does change substantially and you're needing to get that information back, those strokes may not come in. However, things derived, again, from those generators will. So, for example, if we did some edge wear and we wanted to have some additional edge wear on here, let me go ahead and, I often do this. I might find one. So I've got this here. Additionally, I can go in, maybe duplicate this layer, and we'll do a different kind of mask on this. So we'll just clear the mask, and we're in a new thing. So we have a way to visualize masks a little more easily, just your options. So you can go down to Smart Masks and wait for these thumbnails to generate, or we can, yeah, here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and grab, let's just try this Edges Uber. It's like a strong, contrasty way to grab some edges from your curvature. And we'll throw that right on our mask. Now, I could go in and hand paint additional wear in just certain areas. But I could also go in and fine-tune this in such a way that that would update correctly with a new set of UVs if the model was completely in a different location, or what have you, for that situation where it would mismatch to your 3D strokes. Your strokes stored in 3D space. On that layer, I could go in and adjust things, and then later come back in and just paint out and just paint in exactly the areas that I wanted to keep as an additional wear layer. So working in this way and just sort of setting up a process where you're keeping those checks in place is going to allow you to create more flexibility in reworking things later on, and jumping off of work you've already done. Gotcha. One thing I do want to cover as well is the difference between a regular layer and a fill layer. When I first started using Substance Painter, I was thinking of it in a very Photoshop 2D way. I have a layer, I paint in the layer, I'm good to go. With Painter, we've got fill layers, which are great. So right here we have a green smiley face for a fill layer, and this layer right here is just a regular layer. And those strokes are stored, everything's good, it will update. However, the thing about a regular layer is whatever you've painted in there is just static. You can go in and update things. For example, with the brush, I can go in and change, make sure this layer is selected. I can change some settings, maybe add some height, and paint additionally. But all these settings that I'm changing to work with multiple channels of our textures aren't going to update the strokes I've already done. The opposite is true with a fill layer. So in this case, it's just a straight color. It can also be a material or whatever, but just for demonstration purposes, it's easier to see this. I've done this earlier, but let's say I want to go in and modify anything I've already done. Well, I can go ahead and push that in with the height channel. I think I can just make it matte instead of shiny, so it's a little more contrasty on the blade there. We'll go ahead and make it metallic since it's in metal, and go ahead and change its color. We have full flexibility and control over a fill layer. It wasn't until my maybe second or third project in Painter where I started to learn the advantages of using this versus a standard layer. And so I'd certainly recommend you experiment with using those wherever possible. And again, within a fill layer, we can continue to add channels that weren't originally painted into it. For right now, I'll enable emissive on this guy, and I'll just go ahead and make it emissive, which would be you're able to set the intensity of emissive display in your view settings. But the reason this is important is it could be that the first pass you do on something is great, but what if something comes along where it's like, we really want this to be a different way, or why don't we change this to this color, or well, that thing that's bumping out, why don't we bump it in instead? You're going to find situations like that, whether they come from you or from someone else, and having this full editability on a fill layer allows us to turn off the emissive there, allows us to basically have infinite control over whatever we put into that layer. And this will save you lots of time down the road. Let's see. All right. So with that topic said, another thing that I want to bring up is it's frequent in modern engines, game engines, as sort of I'm more familiar with, where you're going to want to use masks that you generate in here for additional purposes outside of just the textures that you're generating. And to that end, you have kind of multiple options about how you set up masks that give you some additional ways to isolate just certain parts of the things you've done. So let me see, we'll go ahead and give an example of that. Turn off that fill layer. By the way, also with the new anchor points that were just announced, something like this detail on a fill layer would be able to be connected via an anchor point to other areas where I've got edge wear and so on, so that, and this is shown very well by Wes in the video they just released, but if we wanted to get that same kind of edge wear that I'm showing here around these edges, since this is a thing that isn't in our bake, it's not going to pick that up right away, and anchor points is kind of a way to get around that, as well as do some other pretty neat things. So I'll look forward to playing around with that. However, if we go ahead and take a look at, so let's say we wanted to do a general edge wear over this entire model. We of course are only going to want to show certain parts of it in certain areas, but just as an example, I'm going to go ahead and again create a fill layer. You'll see that since it's on top, it's just kind of overriding everything with the channels that I have active. So for ease of use, I'm just going to turn everything off except for color, and we'll go ahead and select something. We'll select this kind of gold yellowish color. Now within this, there's multiple ways to go about setting up some control over the layering you want to do in your masks. One of them is, of course, using effect stacks, which are, again, layers on your layers. So I'm going to go ahead and add a generator here, which is going to go ahead and add into my black mask. We'll just go ahead and select, we'll do this metal edge wear, and you should see, there we go. It's looking at our source maps and chugging out something with settings that we can go back and control at any time, which is further working into the non-destructive workflow that Painter provides for you. So at any point, we could come back and change any of this. And this is detail I'm not putting into a standard layer, it's just in a mask. And so this mask is now available for me to use in my engine or anything else for other reasons. Maybe an effects artist wants to do something where things light up in just a certain way. You're able to create masks for that purpose or repurpose masks that you may have already made for that purpose. So we've got that effect right there. We'll go ahead and add a paint as a common operation. I've just got a mouse here, so why don't I go ahead and paint with particles, which is a really cool feature of Painter as well. We'll go ahead and grab this fracture particle, and we're going to make sure our grayscale value is set to white, so it's going to add visibility into this mask. Just do a quick click drag. So now we have this on top, but this is a layer itself. It can be turned off. It can be adjusted in various ways. You can lower even the intensity or opacity of it. So yet again, another layer of control that we have down the line. Often creating a certain effect, it's great at the time, but as you progress further into the thing or that you're making, or maybe it's an asset for a level and you get a few more months down into the level and you've made some changes in the way things are going to go, you come back into your files and be like, you know what, this no longer really makes sense for what I'm doing here, so I'll just go ahead and turn that off. You can re-export your textures, of course. You can re-export your masks, and all of that should update accordingly depending on the setup that you've got going on. But building control into your masks using these effect stacks is one of the ways to go about it. Another, of course, is that, as you can see, this is working across the whole model right now, where maybe I just want this only on the blade. So when I first started, probably what I would have done is I would have color masked this to, or grabbed just the shell of, I'll go into the paint here, turn this to black to turn some stuff off, and then using this fill mode, I can select various ways. I can select just individual faces to turn on or off. This has its own slider. And you can also do it by UV shell, or you can do it by a whole mesh cell. So in this case, into that paint layer, I've just removed all of that stuff. But I've done it in that mask where I had detail that I now have squashed. So I think it may be ideal to go ahead and do this a different way. Either this could be an additional paint layer where I perform the same operation, or I can nest this in a group, and then I can mask that group. I'm just going to do a white mask, which is showing everything right now. Same thing, I could just paint into that mask, but that wouldn't update for me later if I wanted it to. So I'm going to create another paint and go to fill. We'll grab the shell mode, because I just want that whole unique shell. It's not stitched into itself. And we'll just paint that out. So now I'm achieving that effect, but maintaining the detail that I've put into it. Otherwise, if I still want to use that elsewhere for another purpose. But just sort of showing it where I want to show it. And I can come in and do the same thing, add an additional paint, or even a color selection for my ID map. And we'll go ahead and turn off, in this case. And we'll pick this leather. I'll say I don't want it on that leather. So there's multiple tools you have to isolate out areas of your mesh, of course. ID maps being a very commonly used one. Painter gives you some additional features if you do not have an ID mask, or your ID mask doesn't cover things that you want to, say, selectively mask or reveal, which are pretty handy. So doing things this way is also beneficial, because with a layer stack, you're able to layer up the effects in the same way. But in this case, any additional layers I create are going to inherit that same masking. So similar to the setup here, I've got a group for leather, which has its own mask, which is created via color selection, rather than just sort of done straight into the mask, so that will update based on my source maps when I bake new textures. Again, I'm not sure why it didn't work originally. It did this morning on my home machine. So there we go. Doing that is going to help you set up a lot of control. It's building a mentality of giving yourself things you can go back to and reutilize and change infinitely. And you're going to find a lot of uses. Even if it's not every asset you create, I guarantee that at some point it will come in handy for you to be able to return to a file and essentially completely change how everything is set up. And quickly utilize that in ways that may have downstream effects in whatever your workflow may be. Let's see here. So working that certain way, we can achieve that effect. Let me just check my talking points here and see where I'm at. Got about 10 minutes left. So I mentioned not being lazy in the age of smart materials. Maybe this is one example where we have sort of mad scientist, a different kind of look, a different kind of metal out of existing things. I'm sure in certain projects that would be kind of heresy, right? You want to stick to the certain specific values. In this case, that wasn't the case, so I wanted to take the liberty to experiment with that. And with materials and smart materials, I mentioned earlier, for people who are newer to Substance Painter, a smart material is just a collection of effects and layers that you can save out. So for example, this metal that I've done, if I liked it, I could create a smart material out of it. I can right click on this group and say create smart material, and that should be available for me in the smart material menu. Didn't name it there, but should probably inherit the name of the group. To throw on other parts as, I could model, 20 different weapons or items or props that maybe I want to utilize the same look. Of course, any sort of custom painting you've done into masks is specific to this model, so it's good if you are making a smart material to hide or maybe strip out things that were custom to that model just for the version, maybe duplicate the group. Strip out things that aren't sort of basically generated off of your source maps so that you're not going to have weirdly splotched painting on other models with totally different setups. But you can utilize that to great effect and mix things on top of it to achieve even greater custom effects. And I'm going to try one more time to see what might have gone wrong with our bake originally. Let's go ahead and keep the work we've just done, and we'll go to project configuration. We'll select this rotated mesh where I've just switched the UVs around. Preserve strokes on position on mesh is enabled, so this should work. And if it does not, then I'm a bit at a loss. So we'll do this, and then we'll rebake. We'll watch it recompute, and we'll see what happens. In the meantime, I've actually found that it's beneficial. It helps me to modify a few hotkeys in Painter. I was able to change most of them without stomping any other functions in Painter. But like most of us, we use a lot of other softwares and hopping between different effects. Oh, let me see what happened here real quick. Let me pause my thought. Tremendous. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why this isn't functioning the way it normally does for me. But what we should see is an update. Maybe it's something that could be a little bit off in this version. We'll see. As I bake these new maps with the new layout, as you can see, this is just rotated around. Some of these details are being baked to it while others are not switching over. So something is going amiss here, which is a bummer. I'm going to go ahead and open a different project just to kind of close out on a slightly different subject. So if I go back here, I'll bring up a little bit more of a complicated model with a bit more going on. and just sort of use it as a little bit of a talking point. So with this particular model, it has multiple material IDs because I was creating multiple texture sets for it. It has materials that I was going to do little bits and parts of in Painter and then reference into additional work I was doing in Unreal 4 at the time. So for example, the cloth and the glass in here. We didn't have a gloss material, and I knew I was going to do that on engine side, so I just put something reflective on it. But the point I want to bring up here is, none of this was baked in this exact way. It wasn't baked out in a posed model. I had my symmetrical model with my pieces that I wanted to bake. I created a project for that where I brought all those meshes, baked all my maps for everything, where it maintained all of the material IDs that I wanted. And then back in Maya, I've got the thing posed out the way I want. It's actually like 2 or 3 times bigger than it originally was. Bringing it back in, and all of that work continuing to snap because it's just referencing those material IDs. And one of the benefits of doing something like this is now you're not texturing blind to the full context of this model. In this case, maybe where this kind of stone hand contacts this item, I would want to put some grunge in there. I would want to kind of help separate those surfaces, or same thing around where the cloth and the pedestal meet. And if I was doing all these things individually and just putting them together later, I wouldn't have that information for my mind to grab onto as I went about my texturing. So I always like to get the most context possible whenever you're getting into a fine level of detail, and it's just something that I think is good to know, that you can start that way and then keep re-importing new variants of your model as needed in order to achieve that. In cases like this where we have multiple separated things that are baked, and then putting them all together in a pose was quite helpful for me to see how I was going to do things. The cloth in this case, I threw a tiling cloth on here, but this wasn't actually the detail I was going to be using. I came in here to paint sort of all this accumulated dirt and a little bit of transparency, which I was then able to bring out and just put right into Unreal and make that work just fine on top of detail normal work I was doing in there, and masking out areas to put sort of like embroidered details and other such things as that. So additionally, not everything you see in Painter has to be made in Painter. The feathers were just something that I made in ZBrush and just kind of baked out in XNormal, and again, I wanted to have them in here so that I could kind of see what areas they were occluding and have that information as I was texturing. So I was able to just bring those in as normal. You can always import your own textures. You don't have to necessarily bake in Painter, though it's highly recommended because it does a great job. But yeah, that's just one way you can kind of utilize constantly swapping out your models, just knowing the setup you have to have. Again, in this case, the materials would need to be named the same and assigned to the same objects, but I could go in and completely change how this model is posed or worked, or even move a few things around, update all that work, and carry on just straight from there. And while this may be a little bit more obvious today, a few years ago this just wasn't the case. You didn't have the ability to jump off of work you've already done in the texturing process quite as much as you do today. And that's about it. Apologies that the bake did not update everything as intended. What should have happened there is all the edge wear and all those masked in areas and the different layers I had created to wear down the leather and so on and so forth should have snapped and updated to the new bake, basically making all of that texture work redone completely. So I'll have to look into what happened with that again. But yeah, that just about does it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Round of applause, everyone. So I'm just going to quickly announce the winner of the online prize. So if you're watching on live stream, Don Amateur. So you've won a 1-year subscription to Substance and a 6-month subscription to No Man Workshop. Everyone here in the stage, the food truck is outside. Lots of chicken, tarts, that kind of stuff. It'll be great. So head on outside. We'll come back in here at 1 p.m.